Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our online audience. Thank you for tuning in tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am very pleased to introduce tonight's talk with Adam Harris, presenting his debut book, The State Must Provide: Why America's Colleges Have Always Been Unequal and How to Set Them Right. Joined in conversation by Natasha Warikoo. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our ever-expanding community. We host virtual events like tonight's 5 times a week. You can find our event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter or browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's event is going to conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask our speakers something, please go to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can submit a question. We're going to get through as many as time allows for this evening. Also, a reminder that if you would like closed captions, you can click the live transcript tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen to enable them. In just a moment, I'm going to be posting a link to purchase tonight's featured book, The State Must Provide, in the chat box. Your book and ticket purchases make virtual author events like this possible, and now more than ever support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for tuning in during these strange virtual times. We sincerely appreciate the support now and always. And finally, as you've certainly experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues can arise, and if they do, I'm going to do my best to resolve it quickly. So thank you for your patience and your understanding. And now I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. Praised for his brilliant storytelling, Adam Harris is a staff writer at The Atlantic, covering education and national politics. Prior to The Atlantic, he was a reporter at Chronicle of Higher Education and worked at ProPublica. A 2021 New America Fellow and a recipient of the Rising Star Award by the News Media Alliance. He's also a frequent guest on CBS News, MSNBC, and radio stations nationwide. Tonight, he's joined in conversation by author and educator Natasha Warikoo. She's professor of sociology at Tufts University, a former Guggenheim Fellow, and the author most recently of The Diversity Bargain and Other Dilemmas of Race, Admissions, and Meritocracy at Elite Universities. Tonight, the two will be discussing Adam's debut book, The State Must Provide. Of the book, George Packer writes, Adam Harris is the kind of journalist we most need: meticulous in his research, careful in his thinking, passionate in his vision. This book is powerful, quietly angry, revelatory, and utterly persuasive. As a book that chronicles the legal, social, and political obstacles erected to block equitable education in the United States, Clint Smith calls it an invaluable text from a supremely talented writer. We are so pleased to be hosting this event tonight. So without further ado, Adam and Natasha, the digital podium is yours.
Thank you so much. And it's great to be joined by all of you this evening. I want to start actually by walking through kind of some of the roots of this book. And there are a couple of readings that I wanted to do. But first, to sort of set the stage, right? The book opens in the introduction with an examination of where some of the ideas came from, where my first idea to write this book came from. And it starts on the campus of Alabama A&M University in Huntsville, where I attended undergraduate for my undergraduate education, where my sister was educated, where my uncle had been a drum major, where my mom went to school. And this is an HBCU founded in 1875. And it's about when I go to the University of Alabama, Huntsville, right down the street. So just imagine you are at an HBCU and you're driving 10 minutes down the road to an institution that was founded 75 years after your own. Pulling onto UAH's campus felt like lifting a veil. There were newly constructed buildings. The grass was finely manicured and fountains burst forth from man-made ponds. The school looked like it had received a facelift within the last few years, or at the very least, had benefited from some good maintenance. Once I settled in at the library, I did a bit of digging. UAH was founded in the 1950s in part because segregation was the law. There were 2 colleges for Black students in the city: Oakwood University, the private Seventh-day Adventist affiliated college, and Alabama A&M, which was publicly funded, but which white students could not attend either. The Alabama law that segregated Black and white students was known as Section 256. And though it was not officially implemented until 1901, when the state adopted its constitution, Its effects, locking Black people into an unequal educational system if education was allowed at all, had been an unwritten rule since before the Civil War. Several states had made it a crime to teach an enslaved person to read and write. South Carolina was the first in 1740. Georgia followed in 1759. In 1833, Alabama instituted a fine of up to $500 as punishment for those caught teaching enslaved people to read. North Carolina banned educating Black people altogether. The bans did not stop Black people, though. They began learning in secret. They risked the lash to learn. When slavery ended, discrimination stayed, but so did the thirst for learning. Southern states threw up every barrier they could to education, and Black people broke them down time and time again. Northern states erected barriers too, even if not always as overtly. I'll jump forward a little bit to one. You should also know that my dog, Biko, is joining us for this evening's conversation. But I just want to point to one more piece, and it's when Amos Hall is arguing for equal education in Oklahoma. He's fighting to get Ada Louise Sipple Fisher into the University of Oklahoma's law school as the first Black student. And the state is effectively arguing that, if a Black student wants to attend a law school in Oklahoma, then we will set one up for them. It'll just take some time. They will have to wait for it. And Amos Hall is rebutting that argument, saying, they haven't even brought Langston up to an accredited college standard, Hall rebutted. How do you expect them to set up a law school? The state admits that the regents have no money to establish a law school for Negroes. Besides, the cost of setting up the school was not the Black citizens' problem. We did not impose on ourselves this system of dual education, Hall proclaimed. You placed it on us, and if it is expensive, it is not our fault. I think that line, the thought that after all of this history, that yes, it will be expensive to think about the proposition of educational equity. That's important because it is not the responsibility of those who had this system placed upon them, but the responsibility of those who placed the system upon Black people and stymied Black education. So I'm excited for this conversation this evening, and with that, I'm welcoming Natasha to the conversation, and I look forward to joining you all.
Thank you. And thank you to Harvard Bookstore and to Adam for inviting me to join in this really important discussion of this marvelous book. And I said this to Adam earlier, but I just want to reiterate, this is an incredibly well-written, gripping, kind of infuriating, heartbreaking story about the fight to integrate higher education and for African Americans' right to higher education. So this story is about the ways that, and I was telling Adam earlier also that it's a story that we kind of know, as someone who studies higher education, we kind of knew about the Morrill Acts and the exclusion of African Americans and, exclusion of African Americans even at the GI Bill in 1940s. But this book really tells the story in a gripping way and details that I had no idea about. And it's a really important one. So when US higher education was expanding in the 19th century under the two Morrill Acts, which created all of these state universities, including University of Alabama, the first campus, these were created at a time of legal segregation. These are sometimes known as the land-grant colleges, the kind of big state universities that we all know about. The government created these in order to expand higher education, and this is way back in the second half of the 19th century. And then fast forward, 1944 GI Bill, where again it's higher education is seen as a tool for social mobility, but doesn't have a non-discrimination clause. Again, so this is under legal segregation. And so Harris tells us this devastating story of attempts over and over again to integrate higher education to gain access to equitable higher education for African Americans, and particularly in the South. Although I think he rightfully points out that in the North, there were always one or two or three African Americans admitted to these universities, but they were also effectively shut out, if not by law, then through other mechanisms. But this book is really telling the Southern story. So Southern politicians and university administrators went to these extreme lengths to keep African Americans out. They tried sending African Americans out of state for higher education. When they couldn't do that, they tried separate but equal, because that was allowed under Plessy versus Ferguson. When they couldn't do that, they established HBCUs that were never close to being equal. When they couldn't do that, they tried segregation within a college, send the Black student to the basement to have separate classes. And you know, the list goes on, and it's sickening, really, how wedded these states and leaders were to lead to enforcing racial segregation. But this book also is a story of perseverance and dedication to education among ordinary African Americans, as well as leadership in the NAACP and legal advocates, African American legal advocates, who eventually earned some wins. But I think that, you know, the real heartbreak is that, you know, we are not in a situation we were in terms of the legal segregation, but we are far from equity even today. And, you know, Adam talked about that story at the beginning of the book. And as I read, I kept noticing these parallels to his own experience of being at this HBCU where, you know, your family members had gone to, you always thought you were going to go there, and then suddenly going to this historically white college and seeing this massive difference, you know, and literally like the grass, you know, that's that image of these students in the I think it was the 30s and 40s, of like the mud everywhere when it rained, and this student hoping when visitors came that it would rain so they could see how horrible the conditions were at her college. And so it was really devastating. And I think, you know, and unfortunately, we're at a time, even since Adam went to college, where we're seeing declining enrollments in higher education, especially at open enrollment colleges, where the majority of African American students are going to college, deep financial precarity in HBCUs, and also in community colleges and open access colleges, which is where, again, the majority of African American students are attending. So, you know, just to give you some data, and the Georgetown Public Policy Institute found that 3/4 of Black college students attend open access 2- and 4-year colleges, and just 9% attend selective colleges. So compared to 25% of whites attending selective colleges. And so for, you know, I think in general, when we kind of, as academics, also as journalists are often and academics are so focused on elite colleges. I'm totally guilty of that. I wrote a book about students at elite colleges. But the real story of higher education is the experience that you're talking about, because this is where social mobility is going to happen. It's not happening at places like Harvard, where there's a underrepresentation. And so, you know, and given the pandemic, we have declining enrollment in these colleges. And again, financial crisis. And these are places where, you know, first generation students, Black students, Latinx students, Native American students are going the most. And their enrollment has declined the most through this pandemic. And so, you know, I think the continuity of this story is sort of the most devastating to me. And this book really picks up speed as you go. I would say by the end, it becomes so clear that we need reparations for institutions from higher education. I felt like this story built up, and then when you know, you say that at the end of the book, it was like, of course we do. And you know, because these predominantly white institutions, they are benefiting from endowments that were built at a time of segregation. Their donor base, their donors are people who, you know, some of whom went to college when they were segregated, or are the children of people who benefited when they were segregated. And that's what those endowments are built on. They're built on racial segregation. It even affects research. I had a doctoral student who tried in vain for months to access files on the history of 2 HBCUs for Southern women. Eventually, she pivoted to studying white Southern women's responses to the racial justice movement, because the archives of those colleges were so much more just accessible. They had more resources. They had better, you know, more library staff to be able to get. And it's so, you know, there's so many ways in which this affects colleges that, you know, we don't even see beyond, that goes well beyond the grass. You know, in contrast, you know, I remember being on the faculty at Harvard and someone from the development office coming and saying, we're about to do a capital campaign. what should we ask for? And it's like, you don't need to come to the faculty at one of these colleges and say, what do you want? Because, they're doing so much more with so much less. And, and the other thing I was thinking about that you don't say in the book is, what about a mandate? I've thought about this for many years. What about mandating a percentage of donations to other colleges to saying, okay, whatever donations you get, Harvard or Tufts or whatever, you have to donate X% to an open enrollment college or an HBCU, right? Because those donors are, again, this sort of cycle of inequality is perpetuated through donations. So, just to I see this book, and I also, another book that came to mind as I read this book was Tressie McMillan Cotton's Lower Ed, which is all about the for-profit higher education sector and how it sort of preys on and creates false hope often for the most disadvantaged in our society, including many working class African Americans. And so I think this book, The State Must Provide, it's an incredibly important untold story that is bigger than the books and books on the Ivy League and elites. It really shifted my thinking on race and higher education. So I'm so glad you wrote this book. I think everybody needs to read it. And this story is such an important one as we think about the future of higher education. Thank you for that and congratulations. So I thought I would just ask Adam a few questions and then we can open it up to Q&A from all of you who are listening as well. So I would just love to hear you talk a little bit about how you came to write this book. Like, was it that moment, when you went to Huntsville and you're like, this is crazy, or did that sort of keep coming? I know you covered higher education. Does that keep coming up, or like, what was the process? How did you come to this?
Yeah, so one, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation and for your kind words. I that moment at UAH was the sort of genesis of this book. It put the bug in my mind of why is there such difference, not only in the general character of campus, how they had these new buildings, but you dig a little bit more, you see that this institution has a larger endowment, right? And this is an institution founded 75 years after my own, and thinking about the ways that wealth, right, builds upon itself. It was just a sort of interesting bug to have in the back of my head. I also thought maybe I'm being melodramatic, maybe this is just a singular experience. But as I got into covering higher education, I covered HBCUs, I covered federal higher education policy at the Chronicle, and I was really able to see the ways that policy, both federal and state policy, as well as these court decisions, really shaped the landscape of higher education. Right, and I started, as you mentioned, there were these callbacks over time of things like the grass, the green space is not draining right. So I did a piece in the last story I actually wrote for the Chronicle was about the HBCUs in Mississippi. They had the longest running case to basically prove what it meant to sort of prove to the federal government that you desegregated your higher education system. The Black colleges in Mississippi had started this case in 1975, and by 2002, they'd settled. And effectively, they got $500 million for the state over 17 years, split between these three institutions. To put that amount of money into context, the University of Mississippi can make $500 million in 5 years of private donations. And so to think that, they were going to eliminate all of the vestiges of racial discrimination in their higher education system with $500 million, didn't strike me as right. And then on top of that, right, there were little things in that settlement, like the fact that the state higher education board was supposed to raise a $35 million endowment for the HBCUs. And to that point, I think they had raised something like $750,000. And now, right, the settlement is supposed to, it'll phase out next year. And they've only raised $1 million of that 35 million. And so knowing that, and after writing that story and digging into some of that history, knowing that there were several states that hadn't proven that they desegregated their higher education systems, it really led me to digging a little bit deeper, saying, knowing that my experience wasn't an anomaly and seeing how that experience more broadly impacted, Black students and the institutions that they had historically attended.
Reminds me of, the endowment tax that, I always felt like that was like the one thing that I agreed with Donald Trump with. But yeah, maybe these universities, those, it only applied to very few like super rich universities, but maybe they should play it in. I mean, I don't think Trump had was going to give that money to HBCUs, but if the president said we're going to do that and we're going to take that money and invest it into HBCUs, I would be, I'd be 100% behind it.
Yeah, and I think that there should be, we should be thinking about more creative ways to ensure that equity is baked into some of the funding mechanisms that institutions have. As you mentioned, a large share of students are attending community colleges. And in North Carolina, if you're looking at just the public institutions, 22% of Black students attend one of the 12 predominantly white four-year institutions. 25% of Black students in the state that are attending public colleges attend one of the 5 HBCUs. And 52% of the Black students who attend public college in the state attend one of the public community colleges. And so really, if you start to think about the ways that state funding models are set up, I think that the more we can sort of emphasize equity in that, the better. And then for institutions like Ole Miss, this is a college that in 1870, where the faculty was actually saying, we would rather resign, we would all rather this institution close than admit a Black student. Meanwhile, the state legislature is shorting Alcorn State of its guaranteed $50,000 appropriation for a decade. In 1871, they were given a guaranteed appropriation of $50,000. And Biko is very talkative this evening.
He's just as outraged as we are.
Just as outraged as we are. But they were given a guaranteed appropriation for 10 years of $50,000. It was shorted to $15,000 in 1875 and down to $5,500 in 1876. And so you start to see that wealth stratification created, and you wonder whether that institution that was benefiting from additional funding while this other institution in the same state, both public institutions, was being shorted, you wonder if that institution really digs into that responsibility. And for his outrage, I'm actually going to let him out of the office really quickly. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk a little bit now about how you did this research and found out about all of these stories. I was thinking about the story of Lloyd Gaines, who is the plaintiff in in a case that leads to the Supreme Court, goes to the Supreme Court to get access to I think it was a graduate program, if I remember correctly. And he, his life is on hold for years. He can't get a job because his name is kind of tainted in the meantime. And eventually he just disappears. And he writes a letter to his mother saying that this has just ruined my life. I don't remember the exact phrase, but I was just, it made me curious about how did you find these stories, and what was the research process like for you?
Yeah, so it was a mix of sort of digging into university archives, digging through records at the Library of Congress, as well as digging into old newspapers. I mean, I can't say enough about archivists and the work of archivists at this moment. It made things a lot easier, and also the digitization of archives made things rather seamless. But for a lot of these stories, right? So some of them are stories of people that we know. We know who George Washington Carver is, but we don't know how he connects to the land grant system, right? Iowa being one of the first states to accept the land grant and not enrolling a Black student for 30 years because the federal government wasn't requiring them to. Yeah. And when they ultimately do, it's George Washington Carver. For Lloyd Gaines, right? This was one of the first cases where the NAACP was really trying to test the idea of separate but equal in higher education and in education writ large, right? These are so between Gaines, Sipple Fisher, and McLaurin, these are really some of the building blocks of the Brown v. Board decision, right? So if you're thinking about that Gaines case, thinking about the fact that they didn't even have a separate institution where he could attend in state. They were doing the scheme of sending Black students out of state. And that had its own repercussions for the institutions that they attended, right? So in Kentucky, they said, okay, we'll appropriate $5,000 to send Black students out of state for graduate education, but we're also going to take $5,000 from our HBCU's budget. And then ultimately won't spend that full $5,000 to send students out of state. And so for Gaines, I think that, it was about moving his story beyond simply the case law. Understanding that the people who are involved in these fights, it takes a personal toll on them as well, right? You talk about that letter that he wrote to his mom, and this is one of the last times he ever speaks to a member of his family, and he says, I'm just a man. Not a man who has fought for this cause, and no, just a man. And he says, sometimes I wish that no one ever knew my name. And it really speaks to the difficulty that they were going through internally, as well as being, the public faces of these fights. And his education was put on hold. He wanted to be a lawyer, and the best way to study law and to be a lawyer in that state, he wanted to be a lawyer in Missouri, and he was like, I want to practice here, so I need to learn how to be a lawyer here. They didn't have a place for him to do that. And I think the last thing is that just thinking about their stories, from George McLaurin to Ada Louise Sippel Fisher to Lloyd Gaines, as students, they didn't want too much different than what students want now. To receive a proper education, to live out their dreams, to be a lawyer, McLaurin was, in the tail end. So he was, trying to get his, get additional graduate education. So, but he had already been a professor, but they were trying to, get some of the things that students nowadays want. And when you think about higher education in these fights in the abstract, you can lose sight of the fact that these people were fighting really tooth and nail for something that the state, that the Constitution says, according to 13th, 14th Amendment, that it's required that the state is providing them this equal education. The state must provide comes from a case where they say, the state must provide an education to her in accordance with the 14th Amendment. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, as soon as it does for any other student. And for so long, state and federal governments, as well as higher education institutions, had not been doing.
Yeah, I think that's another piece of this story that that was new to me, was how integrated the quest to integrate K-12 education with the quest to integrate higher education, and that these kind of higher ed cases were the kind of building blocks for Brown v. Board of Ed. So that was, I wasn't aware of that. And I think it's a story that we just don't, it's not there's so much kind of focus on K-12, but we forget that this is happening in higher education as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really interesting because the reason why they chose higher ed is because it was so clear cut, right? Like, if you believe the lie of separate but equal, then the first thing you have to do is present a separate institution. And states fundamentally were not doing that. The quote I said from Amos Hall, the lawyer in Oklahoma at the beginning, right? That comes from him saying, the state has not created a separate institution. Now you think the same state that is not even willing to create a separate institution is going to both create a separate institution and make it equal. And his a sort of provocation in his thought ultimately ended up bearing out, because when the Supreme Court says, yeah, you have to create a separate institution, the state of Oklahoma does so in 5 days for Ada Louise Sippel Fisher. They rent out a room in the state capitol and hire 3 part-time faculty members for what would be full-time work, and say that this institution is equal to the one that's been at the University of Oklahoma for more than 50 years. And so it's the levels that states really went to play into this lie of separate but equal, when they were when they weren't even sort of peddling in separate but equal, saying we don't even have a separate graduate program, we don't have a separate law school, but we want you to believe the lie of separate but equal, because that's what's propping up and maintaining our segregated institutions and our customary way of life.
It's amazing how great lengths they went.
I think we might be frozen. I think we are. I actually, to pick up actually on what Natasha was just saying, the lengths that these institutions went to maintain segregation. So in Oklahoma in particular, right after they had, rushed this law school into existence in 5 days, that Ada Luisa Fisher ultimately didn't end up attending. Not long after that, once George McLaurin's case is working its way through, they integrate the University of Oklahoma, but they literally put him in a room off to the side. Thurgood Marshall actually has a quote where he said, that man is peeking into the classroom. After the Supreme Court says that they can't do that, they put a bar up in the classroom, a little railing up in the classroom to segregate Black and white students. And it really showed the sort of commitment to segregated education. But fast forwarding to now, right, you have to think about the ways that that segregated education, that history is propulsive, where it's no longer by law, HBCUs no longer have a sort of monopoly on Black education, but those predominantly white institutions that have a lot of funding, that receive, healthy state funding, even if they're not private institutions, are still enrolling paltry amounts of Black students. If you look at a place like Auburn University, that in the 1980s was, on the same day that Bo Jackson wins the Heisman as the best college football player in the country, a federal judge says that Auburn's the most segregated institution in the state of Alabama. Fast forward to 2002, they have not many more Black students than they did in 1985, and now they have fewer Black students than they did in 2002. So thinking about the ways that legacy is propulsive, and it speaks to the situation of that foundation of America's inequitable colleges is sort of continuing on into the current day. And I imagine we're trying to get Natasha back on now, but I also see that we are starting to get questions in from the Q&A. So Kate, I'm not sure how you want to handle that.
Hey, yeah, I think I'm hearing that Cambridge and Somerville just had a brief power outage and then the power went back on. So I'm hoping that's what's happening, but maybe not. I'll keep an eye out for her. Yeah, I'll ask you this question though that's already here. So we have a question from an anonymous attendee. That's, what policies should we be prioritizing in order to equitably fund education for all students? And just a reminder to everyone watching, if you have further questions that Natasha hasn't gotten to yet, please send them here. So yeah, Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple of things, right? So one, I think that states should really be looking at, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but really looking at their performance-based funding models. A lot of states sort of think about, the enrollment of students. So how many students an institution has, their graduation rates. But I think that you should really be building in this idea of equity and what students an institution is actually serving, right? If you are only serving, students from that top, 10% of income household, then it's going to be a very different situation. Oh, here we go. Okay. But yeah, I think it's going to be a very different result in terms of what students actually can do, and what supports that they need, I should say, than an institution that is serving predominantly Pell eligible students, right? HBCUs, I think it's something like 60% of HBCU students are Pell eligible. At a place like Paul Quinn College, it's more than 80% of their students are Pell eligible. And so really thinking about how institutions are being funded and making sure that they're funded equitably is incredibly important. And then on top of that, I think, looking to the federal government, I know that there are several bills that are working their way through the legislature right now. Representative Alma Adams has the Ignite Act, which would help rebuild sort of the infrastructure at HBCUs. But I think you're really thinking of creative ways, both through legislation and then also through state funding models, is incredibly important in order to sort of move towards building that equity.
Thank you for that. Did we lose Natasha, or is she still here? I think she's here, but with her camera off. Natasha, are you there? Nope, maybe not. Sorry for the hiccup, Adam. You handled this incredibly smoothly. We have another question from the audience. So, in addition to public and government investment in education, what can private colleges and universities with endowments do to make a meaningful difference in the communities they are based in and the broader educational landscape?
Yeah. So, a lot of institutions over the last several years have undertaken, right, these sort of examinations of their legacies with slavery, examinations of their legacies with segregation. University of Virginia, I wrote a story a couple of years ago where, Thomas Jefferson is saying that you can't imagine the University of Virginia without sort of the basis of slavery. And so, for those institutions, I think that there is a very vital role for them to play, not only in, Georgetown, I know, has built out the a funding mechanism for descendants of the 272 people who were sold in order to keep the university afloat. But I think that there may be more to do there, right? For the institutions that were serving Black and Brown students, as these institutions were keeping them out, there is some responsibility in order to help prop them up, because these institutions are still doing remarkable work to educate that student population. As I mentioned, in a place like Oklahoma, Langston University is a public college, land-grant institution in Oklahoma. It's where Ada Louise Sippel Fisher went. And they have a Black enrollment of something like 1,450 students. Now, putting that enrollment in context, the University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University combined only have a couple hundred more Black students than they have at Langston University, right? And these are institutions with 40,000 enrollment combined. And so, thinking about those institutions, thinking about private institutions like Georgetown, I think that, for particularly the unrestricted bequests, like maybe we think about ways that those unrestricted bequests can be, sort of equitably distributed in order to help other institutions. And I also think, this is sort of the last thing on that point, I had a conversation with Ruth Simmons a couple of years ago, where she talked about universities as sort of truth-telling, as one of the primary functions of universities is truth-telling. And if universities don't tell the truth, then they just become another corrupt institution that deserves to be pilloried. So as these institutions are going through that work of uncovering their history, of telling that truth about where they've been and where they need to go, I think that aiding these other institutions that have done such significant work for Black and Brown students should fit squarely into that mission.
That's fascinating. Thank you. We actually have a follow-up question from Denisa in the audience about what we were just talking about. So she says, I love to hear you discuss performance-based funding in the context of equity. Performance-based funding is discussed as antithetical to equity, and in some manifestations that's warranted, but it all comes down to policy design. Can you speak a little bit more to how performance funding models can enhance equity?
Absolutely. And Denise might actually know this better than anyone. She's a fantastic teller. And so I think that in relation to, if you think about building a performance-based funding model around the number of low-income students or percentage of low-income students an institution is enrolling, rather than saying, the University of Kentucky, hey, you have a lot of students who graduate on time, but they're also, the top 10% of students from their institution. So they were probably in a better position to be prepared for college. As opposed to doing that and saying that, yes, we want to build it around the number of marginalized and minoritized students that you have. So the number of Black and Brown students that you have, the percentage of low-income students that you have, Pell eligible students, the amount of first-generation students that you have. And if you have that up front, rather than trying to build it into the back end of your system, because that's oftentimes what we see, right? Where a state will have their funding model and then try to rethink and put equity into an already inequitable model, which in a lot of ways is the problem that we've had with higher education writ large, right? It's that sort of inequity is propulsive. And I one of the institutions that I actually highlight in the book that's not an HBCU, and it's a private institution in Kentucky, is Berea College. And Berea actually kind of carries all the way through the book, in part because contra to the rest of higher education, a lot of higher education, Berea actually did have that idea of equity and equality baked into its initial formulation, right? John Fee, the founder of the college, built it on Acts 2 and 27. God hath made of one blood all the people of the earth. So he created the first interracial integrated coeducational college in the South, and this is in the 1850s. And so it's not to say that people weren't thinking about education and educational equity back then. But to think about where they are now, right? Where it's an institution that hasn't charged tuition since 1892. It's an institution that is almost back to being a 50-50 institution with 50% white students and a mix of Black students, brown students, international students, Asian students. And they are thinking about these ideas of equity. And so I think that if you have that up front and higher education reorients itself to that original mission that Berea had and that it's needing to learn anew, policymakers can put us in a better place in terms of how funding is meted out and ensure it's equitably done.
We have a question that I love from the audience. That is, would canceling student debt or making higher education free help combat underfunding of HBCUs and open enrollment schools?
I think so. It is the student debt cancellation conversation is an equity conversation, in part because you think about the fact that Black students are more likely to take on student debt, they're more likely to take on more student debt, they're more likely to default on their loans after they leave college, whether that's with a degree or without that credential that gives them that earnings boost. I think that at its fundamental level, that actually is an equity conversation I think would be beneficial. But you can't have that kind of student debt cancellation conversation in isolation. That needs to be had in conversation with a debt-free, tuition-free college model. And luckily, a lot of the sort of tuition-free college models that have been proposed, that were proposed on the campaign trail, that have been kind of tossed around in recent months, really did focus on and include HBCUs in their formulation, not just private HBCUs either, but public HBCUs, to kind of point to that historic work that these institutions have done in current work, producing 25% of Black STEM graduates, 50% of Black lawyers and doctors, 80% of Black judges, all coming from HBCUs even still today. And so I think if we ensure that HBCUs kind of continue, Natasha, if they continue in that conversation, and are major pieces in that discussion, not just kind of peripheral, we're going to add HBCUs in the back end. I actually do think that starts towards combating that legacy of underfunding. But I think more than that, there does need to be these I do think there do need to be large injections of funds to historically Black colleges because of that legacy of underfunding, and because that legacy is incredibly recent, right? A place like North Carolina A&T, when it made the jump in 2004, 2005 to become a high research producing activity institution, they weren't giving any additional funding by the state. When two public, predominantly white institutions did the same thing, a year and 2 years later, respectively, they received $10 million apiece to make that jump to become high research producing activities, institutions. And North Carolina A&T is still fighting to this day in this current legislative session to get that $10 million of funding that the predominantly white institutions were afforded. They've gotten $2.5 million of that to this point. And so thinking about that legacy of underfunding and the current underfunding, I do think that there need to be large injections of funds into these institutions to make up for them.
I am so sorry. I think the network went down here, and then everyone was on their cell phone. I couldn't even. You probably saw me for a second trying. I even went outside. I was like, maybe I don't know that way. Anyway, now it's all working.
No worries.
So I think I probably missed some of the discussion. You may have answered my last kind of burning question already, but I'm going to ask it. And if you already answered it, we can move on. And I should say, Kate, I can't see any of the questions in the thing. So maybe you can.
We were going through audience Q&A while you were gone. So.
Okay, yeah. Great. I just would love to hear, what you hope it will come as a result of this book. More broadly, just in general, and then in particular, like, what do you want to see happen given what you know about higher education in the United States?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one I've been thinking about a lot recently, right? So it's like my first thought with the book was I wanted to put in one place the sum of how higher education came to be inequitable. And as you mentioned earlier, right, a lot of these things are things that we've known about, and like, but putting them all in conversation with each other to really connect the dots there. And I think that, having this for a general audience it can serve as a sort of guide to understanding the ways that I write in the book that discrimination is a contortionist, bending and twisting to fit within the confines of the system that it's given. That the ways that has happened and the ways that it is still happening. And I would hope that this book leads policymakers to think differently about the way that they're funding public institutions, leads philanthropists to think differently about the ways that they're thinking about their philanthropic giving. Right, last year it was a phenomenal year by any stretch, by any definition, for HBCUs. A lot of HBCUs, I should say, not all HBCUs, but it was a phenomenal year. Right, a lot of institutions received their largest ever donation. But you have to think about whether or not that is sustainable, if that giving continues. Because this year, if you look at the Chronicle of Philanthropy's database of the largest gifts to higher education institutions, there are two HBCUs on there with donations above $5 million. And so whereas that last year was fantastic, that you can't necessarily rely on that philanthropic giving to sustain these institutions. So I think that, I would hope that it leads policymakers to think about the funding for HBCUs, community colleges, and other institutions that are serving and have historically served Black and Brown students, to think about how they're equitably funding those institutions, but also for institutions that have benefited from years of being able to build wealth. Thinking about what they owe to these institutions. I know they've started it with the university studying slavery, but to really think about the fact that this goes deeper than renaming buildings. Renaming buildings is an incredibly important thing, and the way that we think about our history and remember things is incredibly important. But I think that there also has to be a financial piece to this, because so much of this is financial. And I really think about the ways that states studied, the financial piece of this time and time again. Kentucky brings in William T.B. Williams and says, what would it take to bring our HBCU up? And this is the early 1900s. What would it take to bring them up to the standards of Tuskegee, to the standards of Hampton? And he says, the girls' dorm is fire prone. It lacks fire escapes. The boys' dorm is in a mud puddle. The power plant, the electrical plant doesn't have power. The teachers are underpaid. The buildings are old. And the state's like, well, we have $40,000. So if I hope that this book would move states to knowing that, you can't, just sort of bargain your way out of this. And to the quote from Amos T. Hall, that yes, it's going to be expensive, but Black people didn't impose an inequitable higher education system on themselves. So it's not necessarily their fault that it's going to be expensive to fix it. And as the title says, the state must provide. The state and federal government was responsible for creating and defending this inequitable system, and it's the onus is on state and institutions that benefited to fix it.
It strikes me as even this whole, like, the amount of the university budgets for these PWIs resting on the endowment, interest from the endowment, and on philanthropy. It's such a weird financial model, And I just think the way that our higher education system works, right? The spending is regressive, right? We spend the least amount of money on our community colleges and HBCUs, and though they are the engines of social mobility, and they are the students with the most need in terms of academic enrichment, in terms of just financial precarity, needing basic cost of living. And when we rely on these endowments and philanthropy, it just exacerbates inequality and makes it so hard to address it. I mean, it just seems like, I don't know. I think about that, like with respect to admissions, like, I think, well, all of these like the selective colleges, they can't really afford to like not admit more privileged students and unprivileged students because they can't afford it. Right? Even a place, like Harvard. I mean, but all of these places, like they rely on a certain percentage of students who are full fee paying. I'm a little stressed by just running around trying to get back onto the internet. Full fee paying students, excuse me. And so they assume that that's what they're going to have, and they're running on these endowments and these like donations, and it's just like how it just seems like such an uphill battle because of the way that they're structured.
Exactly. And to your point earlier about, thinking about the endowment tax and thinking about, how those institutions can help other institutions with their endowment, right? Where if, some of these, very well endowed institutions can make $1 billion a year in returns on their endowment investments. And so, thinking about that, and thinking about the way that sort of wealth has momentum. I do think that there's space for that conversation to be had about, maybe as opposed to a tax, maybe it's a percentage of the endowment returns that those institutions have, percentage of the donations that the institutions receive, especially the unrestricted bequests. I mean, because yes, donations are tied to different things. It's like, oh, this is for the endowed chair for this. This is for this building. But for those donations that aren't tied to anything, I think that there does need to be a conversation had about like, okay, what is our responsibility? What has historically been our responsibility in propagating and promoting this inequitable system, and how can we right that? How can we address it?
Or, if you're making a donation to our new squash court, sorry, but we're taking 10% of that and, donating it to the Texas A&M. Like, I think that would be okay, and I think that would be the morally right thing to do.
Yeah, and like when I was in the book, I read about Bennett College and their drive to raise $5 million over 50 days, and they ultimately were able to do it. Right, it was a sort of Herculean effort. They pulled money from everywhere, but at that same time, there were more than a dozen institutions that received single donations of $5 million. And so I really think that we start rethinking the role of philanthropy and the role that philanthropy has historically played, and thinking about how philanthropists are funding institutions, right? Michael Bloomberg gave more than $1 billion in one fell swoop to Johns Hopkins, right? If you distributed that, to all 100 HBCUs, it's not a lot of money for them, but it's actually a significant sum. For some institutions, it would have been the largest ever single donation, right? My own institution, Alabama A&M, just a couple of weeks ago received the largest donation in its history of $2.2 million. And this was the largest ever single donation in its almost 150-year history. So thinking about that, thinking about the fact that people, often point to philanthropy as this is, a possible solution. You can put it straight into your endowment. I think that we have to think more expansively about the redistribution of endowments, or how we are pushing philanthropy towards giving to these institutions.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. So we probably have time for one last question from someone in the audience. So there's two. I'm going to read both of them to you, and then you feel free to answer whatever in the last few minutes that we have. So one person said, I'm curious if your research into educational funding inequalities has also encompassed funding for public grade school and high schools, and what the similarities and differences are between the problems there and in higher ed. And so lower ed is Tressy's book, so I'm going to say K-12 ed. And then Mike Liverwright said, I would suggest that the nudge 10% be an opt-out or on all contributions. I'm totally with you, Mike. If so, it might be more effective than a requirement. So
yeah, I think I would agree with that as well. If you have it as an opt-out. And actually, to the first question, I've I've actually thought, in my job at The Atlantic a lot about K-12 funding over the last several years. And, the difference, one of the primary differences is how K-12 funding is pooled, right? It's something like at least 35% of most school districts are coming from kind of local tax dollars. In some places, it can be more. So if you're looking at a place like Westlake in Austin, right, they're going to have more funding coming from those public tax dollars. And so I think that the similarities and differences can kind of, there are some similarities where if at a state level, states were more aligned with equity in their mission in terms of funding, particularly for public institutions. I think that central piece, right, that it's higher or K-12 not being as locally defined in terms of its funding and moving more towards something that, if tax dollars were pooled at a state level and then distributed equitably, that is a possibility. Of course, you run the risk of people moving their children to private schools, even though they would still have to pay that tax. One of the interesting things, just to speak to K-12 and higher ed, oftentimes people focus a lot on the Department of Education and K-12, when in reality, the Department of Education has more say over higher education in terms of like the general policy in higher education. And I think that if we move towards a better understanding of what the federal government is supposed to be doing, right, I think it's like 10% of school district funding comes from the federal government, whereas, if you're thinking about the regulatory responsibility of the federal government, a lot of that is centralized in higher ed, including civil rights oversight. So one of the things that I touch on in the book, and I've talked about a lot recently, is the fact that the federal government needs to sort of fulfill its responsibility to investigate, public education system, higher ed, and K-12 in order to ensure that those vestiges of discrimination, racism aren't lingering, right? There are several states that have settled their way out of federal monitoring, but that have not fundamentally lived up to those agreements. North Carolina, for example, settled in 1980, has not fulfilled its promises for enrollment at its predominantly white institutions of Black students. Mississippi settled in 2002, has not lived up to its endowment guarantee.
You're talking about schools now, right?
This is in higher education.
Higher ed. Okay, sorry.
This is in higher ed. So yeah, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, all of these states have settled and are no longer under federal monitoring. But since they haven't lived up to the agreements of their settlement, it may be time for the federal government to reopen those cases and take a second look and say, have you actually eliminated those vestiges of racism and discrimination?
Right. Right. Such an important, so many important things to think about, and urgent, really urgent, I think, as we think about the future and inequality and growing inequality and the impact of the economic downturn. This is like such a really incredibly important story, an amazing book. Everyone, click on that link in the chat, order a copy. And Adam, thank you for writing this book. And Kate, thank you for inviting me and having me as part of this important conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll just have another round of thank yous. Thank you once again tremendously to Adam and Natasha for sharing this knowledge and this fascinating conversation, and for both of your perseverance with network hiccups. That was really awesome. Great job, both of you. Thank you everyone for spending the beginning of your evening with us and taking the time to learn about something so vital and important. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, have a great rest of your night. Please keep reading and keep learning, and be well. Thank you, everyone.